Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Yoma Daf Mem Gimel contains one Mishnah. From the beginning of the Daf until the Mishnah is primarily a lengthy exposition by Ula of the Psukim describing the steps of the Paraduma and the particular words that are mentioned within each one and what halachos we learn from them, primarily focusing on whether a Kohen is allowed to do these steps or who is allowed to do these steps in fact. Just before the Mishnah, the Gemara returns to our previous Mishnah to discuss why the Kohen Gadol says Vidoi on his cow twice, and then we get to the next Mishnah, which lists the next steps in the service of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, and then it lists a lot of differences between Yom Kippur Avodah and other Avodos of the rest of the year. So first of all, we're discussing the Avoda of the Paraduma. There are a number of steps involved in the Paraduma. Let's list the steps. And the Gemara is working through the Psukim. So the steps are as follows. First of all, the Paraduma is brought outside the camp to Har Hazeisim, then it's slaughtered. That's step 1. Step 2 is that its blood is caught. Step 3 is the blood is sprinkled. Step 4 is that the Paraduma is burned. Step 5 is that Eitz Erez, Ezev, and Shnei Telas, that's cedar wood, grass, and a red strip of wool is added to the fire. Then the ashes are gathered up, the water is filled into a special kli, and the ashes and the water are mixed together. Then it's ready to be used to sprinkle on the person who needs it for his tahara, and that is the final step in the process. Now, in the Psukim describing it, there are a number of words that seem to indicate either we're a continuation of what we saw in the previous pasuk, and the same person who did that is doing this, or there's a change from the previous pasuk. Maybe it's a different person, maybe it's a different circumstance, and Ula is going through all of them and discussing them. So he's already discussed the first couple of steps. He's discussed bringing the cow out to the proper place. Now he's up to the vishachad, we're actually slaughtering the cow. So he said the vishachad oisa, why it says it has to be slaughtered itself. Nothing else can be slaughtered along with it. And then it says lefanav, it has to be in front of Elazar Kohen. So how do you understand that? So what does it mean in front of Elazar Kohen? We've already seen in the previous daf, there's a machlokes between Rav and Shmuel. According to Rav, we know that it's only Elazar Kohen who's doing it. When it says it's in front of Elazar Kohen, it means to say that he has to be paying careful attention to it. According to Shmuel, it's not Elazar Kohen who's doing it, it's somebody else who's doing it, and he has to do it in front of Elazar. This is to teach that somebody else is allowed to do it specifically. Okay, next it says, V'lakach Elazar Kohen midama, and Elazar Kohen should take from the blood in order to sprinkle it. Why does it mention Elazar Kohen specifically? So according to Shmuel, it's very good, because the previous step was not done by Elazar, so now it's telling me going back to what Elazar has to do. According to Rav, it was Elazar before also, so this is a miyut achar miyut. This is mentioning twice the same minimization of who's allowed to do it, and that's to teach that even a Kohen Hedyot is allowed to do this avodah. Meaning it's not that Elazar specifically has to be the one to do it, it has to be a Kohen to do it. And I wouldn't know that it would be a Kohen that's allowed if it would just say Elazar once. I would think that it only has to be Elazar, who was the Skan Kohen Gadol, he was the assistant Kohen Gadol. But by minimizing it to Elazar twice, it's telling me that it doesn't have to be the Kohen Gadol, it could even be any other Kohen who's allowed to do it. Okay, the next pasuk says, V'lakach HaKohen Eitz Erez Ve'ezel V'shnei Telas. Again, it mentions that it's a Kohen. Why do you have to mention it's a Kohen here? So according to Shmuel, up to now we just said that it's Elazar. We only had one pasuk that mentioned Elazar b'dafka. So now this is telling me that it doesn't have to be Elazar. Specifically, it could be even a Kohen Hedyot, it could be even a regular Kohen. According to Rav, we already know that this is to tell me that this step has to be done by a Kohen altogether. You may think that this is not really part of the Paraduma, this is just adding in other ingredients. It doesn't have to be a Kohen. This is teaching me that it does have to be a Kohen. Okay, the next thing is that it says V'chivis b'gadav HaKohen, the Kohen has to wash his clothing, meaning that Kohen became Tameh, and he has to put his clothing in the mikvah. So this is to teach that, when it says the Kohen here, this is to teach that he has to be looking like a Kohen, he has to be wearing the big day kahuna. Then it says V'tamei HaKohen ad ha'erev, again it mentions the Kohen. So that's to teach me that throughout the generations, the Kohen has to wear his big day kahuna. It's not just now, but all other Paradumas, always the Kohen has to be wearing his big day kahuna. So I asks the kasha that we had a machlokas earlier, who does the avoda in the rest of the generations? Other paradumas, who is going to do that? According to one approach, it was the Kohen Hedyot. So then I can understand. It's the Kohen Hedyot who has to do it. Now you have to teach me that he has to be wearing his bigdei kahuna. However, according to the other approach, it's the Kohen Gadol who has to do it the rest of the years. Obviously, then he has to be wearing the bigdei kahuna. You think it's the Kohen Gadol who's not wearing the bigdei kahuna? So the Gemara says, no, even though you could figure it out on your own with the Kal V'chomer, we have a rule that just because you could figure out something from the Kal V'chomer is not a reason for the Torah to avoid teaching it explicitly in the Pasuk, and that's why the Pasuk goes ahead and teaches me this halacha. Okay, next it says, V'asav ish tahara sefer apara, v'hiniach, and he should place it. So here you have two things. It says it should be gathered by an ish. You have three things. An ish, a tahar, and it should be hiniach. So the Gemara says this has to be put by an ish to show that this no longer has to be done by a Kohen. It could be any ish, any man. It says it has to be a tahar. That's to include any tahar person. Even a woman is allowed to do it. But when it says v'hiniach, that means that it has to be done by somebody who knows, understands to put it down in the right spot. That has to be an intelligent person, not a cheresh shota v'kata, not somebody of limited mental capacity or not fully mature. Now the Gemara is going to quote a Mishnah, which is a machlokas on this particular subject. The Mishnah quotes a machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, but who is allowed to do kiddush? Who is allowed to mix the ashes into the water? And they have exact opposite opinions. The Tanna Kama says everybody's allowed to do it except for a katan and people who are similar to a katan, like a cheresh and a shaita. So the Tanna Kama, let's focus specifically on a woman and a katan, an isha and a katan. According to the Tanna Kama, an isha is allowed to do it, a katan is not. Rabbi Yehuda says the opposite. The katan is allowed to do it, an isha is not. And Rabbi Yehuda also adds that since an isha is not, an androgynous, who is a person of indeterminate gender, is a suffix isha, and therefore he or she also cannot. So Gemara says, what is the reasoning here? How do they learn it? So the Gemara says it's an analysis of a pasuk that has a strange contradiction. The pasuk says, you should take the ash and put it in the water, or put the water on it. It says, they shall take, v'nasan, and put it, without saying v'nasnu, without the plural form. So it says v'lakhu in the plural form and v'nasan in the singular form. How do you fit those two things together? So the Rabbanan learn it as follows. The v'lakhu is to tell you that this is the same people that were doing up to now. Just like up to now, as we just said. Up to now could be a man or a woman, but it couldn't be a child or somebody else without das. The previous step just before this couldn't be either of those. It couldn't be somebody without us, but it could be a man or a woman. So this is v'lakhu. This is referring to them. Those people, they should do v'lakhu. These are the ones who could do the actual mixing of the ashes into the water. Now, Rabbi Yehuda says, then if that was the truth, if that was the halacha, then it should say v'lokach. It should say, and he should take. Whoever it is that did it before is doing it now. The v'lakhu is a funny language. It's an odd expression. That's to include that even somebody else who couldn't do it before, there's a pluralism here. Somebody who couldn't do it before could do it now. Before, a katan could not do it. Now, a katan is allowed to do it. Now, how do you know that a woman cannot do it? So that's why it says v'nasan. It uses a singular form here. It says v'nasan, that it's limiting what we had before. Before, it could be a woman, and now it's not. As a matter of fact, it says v'nasan and not v'nasna. It uses a masculine form and not a feminine form. If it would say v'nasnu, that would be a plural that would include both men and women. The Gemara now launches into a discussion of the next step, and who's allowed to do the next step, which is the mixing of the ashes into the water. And the Gemara is going to say that it's a machlokas in a Mishnah. The Gemara is stepping away from Ula here for a minute and is saying that it's a machlokas in a Mishnah. And it's based on how you read a pasuk that's coming up. Do you say that the next step has the same halachas as the previous step, or that it has a different step? What's a machlokas? Machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. According to the Chachamim, it's the same as we said before. Men and women are allowed to do it, but children, chereshet v'katan, are not allowed to do it. This is referring to the mixing of the ashes. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it's the opposite. Children are allowed to do it, women are not. So what's the source? So the Gemara says, according to Chacham, it's very simple. It says in the pasuk describing it, it says, "V'lakhu latamei," and those who did the ashes, v'lakhu, and then they should go ahead and take the ashes. Those who gathered the ashes, and those who did the step before should go ahead and do this step now, and they should mix the ashes into the water, and therefore it's the same thing. Men and women could do it, children cannot. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, look carefully. V'lakhu is a strange word. It should say v'lakach. Why does it use a plural form? It's to include somebody who couldn't do it before. A child couldn't do the previous step, a child is allowed to do this step here. However, then it goes ahead and it says v'nosan in a singular form. V'nosan is a masculine singular form. If it would have said a plural form, okay, that would include men, women, whoever it is. But it uses a singular form and only a masculine form. That's to teach me that only a man is allowed to do the next coming step, and not a woman. So we've included children and excluded women. That's why, according to Rabbi Yehuda, the step of mixing the ashes into the water could be done by children and not women. According to the Rabbanan, it's the opposite. It's like the previous step. It could be done by women and men, but not by children. Now, how do the Rabbanan understand the fact that it says v'lakhu and v'nosan? So it says that's to teach you something else. That's to teach you that it does not have to be done specifically by two people or specifically by one person. If it would say v'lakach and v'nosan, you would think it has to be done specifically by one person. That's why it uses an individual singular form. And if it would say v'lakhu and v'nosnu, you would think it has to be done by two people. Therefore, it uses v'lakhu and v'nosan to tell you that there is no requirement for either of those. Okay, the next and final step is the sprinkling. It says v'lakach eza v'toivel b'mayim ish tahar, and he should take an azov. That's what he uses to spray, and he should dip it in the water. Who should do it? An ish tahar. So you have here the phrase ish and the phrase tahar. So both Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan hold that this switches from the previous halacha. Ish, the Rabbanan say ish v'la isha, a man and not a woman. Tahar to include even a child. Rabbi Yehuda says the opposite. Ish is to exclude a katan. Tahar is to include an isha. So this step is the opposite of whoever was allowed to do the step before. So Gemara now has a kasha. We have a brisa that says as follows: everybody's allowed to do the spraying, the sprinkling. Everybody except for a tumtum and a androgynous and a woman and a katan. Woman and a katan are both excluded. A tumtum and an androgynous, we don't know if they're a man or a woman, or they're neither a man or a woman, are also excluded. So the Gemara says that a katan could do it if a woman helps him. So now the Gemara says that this is a Tanakama here, and Rabbi Yehuda doesn't argue. So Rabbi Yehuda then would seem to agree. If Rabbi Yehuda agrees, then how could we say our explanation of what he said before, that the word ish tahar switches it and says that a katan is not allowed to and an isha is allowed to? It doesn't fit with this. So Gemara says, listen, you have to say that he argues, even though it's not spelled out specifically here in this brisa that he argues. It has to be that he argues, because we know that the language has to change. When we said ish tahar, we're changing from what it said before. That's our rule. That's the rule that Ula said. Anytime you have phrases that seem to change what's going on, it has to change the halacha from what it is before. Okay, the Gemara accepts that. And now the Gemara moves on. The Gemara has one more drasha. The Gemara that says, "V'hiza hatar al tamei." Who sprays? A tahar sprays on the tamei. The Gemara says, why do you call him a tahar? The one who's doing the spraying, why is he called a tahar? The Gemara says, because he's a tahar now. That means that he could be somebody who was tamei yesterday. That means he's a tfil yom, somebody who just went to the mikvah. Well, not yesterday, he just was tamei previously. Somebody who just went to the mikvah, he is now a tfil yom. He doesn't have full tahara. He has to wait for sunset before he has full tahara. And yet he's still allowed to do it. The special halacha that the Chachamim hold of, the Tzedukim disagreed with this, and therefore the Chachamim would specifically have a Tfil Yom do the avoda, the work of the paraduma, to show that the Tzedukim are wrong on this account over here. Okay, now the Gemara is interested as to what the pattern is, what things, who has to do what, when do we change, when do Psukim follow each other, keep the halacha as before, when do they change from before. So the Gemara says we haven't figured out a pattern. The Gemara says Rav Asi says that when he was by Rav Yochanan and Rish Lakish learning the sugya of paraduma, they tried to figure out patterns. They couldn't come up with anything more than a fox gets out of a field that's plowed over, just the dirt on his feet. We didn't get anything substantial to explain it. All we have is that it changes back and forth. We don't know exactly what the order of the pattern is. Okay, now the Gemara reverts back to our previous discussion from Daf Mem Beis as to whether a non-Kohen is allowed to do the shechita of the paraduma. The Gemara says that somebody said a brayso in front of Rabbi Yochanan that all shchitas are allowed to be done by a non-kohen except for the paraduma. And Rabbi Yochanan threw him out. He says, get out of here with that halach, it's not true. All shchitas are allowed to be done by a non-kohen. And the Gemara points out, not only does Rabbi Yochanan disagree with the brayso, he disagrees with his own Rebbe, because Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rav Shimon ben Yehotzadok, his Rebbe, that the shchita of a paraduma has to be done by a kohen, and Rabbi Yochanan said, I personally disagree. Okay, just before the Mishnah, the Gemara refers back to the two vidois that the Kohen Gadol says on his cow. The Gemara wants to know, how come the first video he just says video on himself, and the second video he says on his entire family and all the Kohanim? The Gemara says, why does he say two vidois, and why is the first one only on himself, and the second one is also on other Kohanim? The Gemara says, first he has to say video on himself. He has to be purified of his own averis. Only then is he befitting to come and say video on the other Kohanim, the rest of the Shevet Kahuna. We now begin the next Mishnah, which continues the description of the avodah of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. And the Mishnah begins by saying that the next thing that the Kohen has to do is to shecht his the par Kohen Gadol, and he catches the blood in the special mizrak, the key which is designed for catching of the blood. And then he takes that and he gives it to another person. That person stands in the fourth row of paving stones of the Heichel. The reason that he has to hold it is because the Kohen Gadol himself is moving on to do the machta, the coals, and the ketorah spices, before the sprinkling of the blood on the kaporis. And in order to make sure that the blood will not congeal, it has to be held by somebody who's going to stir it. So the Kohen Gadol then goes onto the mizbeach, and he has with him a special shovel. He does not take the outer coals, he moves those aside, and he takes a shovelful of the inner, boiling, burning hot coals that are full of flame, as he's supposed to do. Then he descends from the mizbech, and he puts it on the fourth row of paving stones, this time of the Azara, not of the Heichel. Now, the Mishnah, the rest of the way, will discuss differences between Yom Kippur and the rest of the days of the year as far as the Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash does. And the majority of these, Rashi says, is in order to make things easier for the Kohen Gadol, who's fasting and has a lot to do, to be able to do all the activities. So it says every single day of the year, the coals were taken in a silver shovel and then poured into a golden shovel. Today we skipped that step, and you just had one shovel made out of gold that he used to scoop up the coals in the first place. Also, every day the silver shovel held more than was put into the golden shovel, either 4 kav of coals or 6 kav of coals, which is a sa, depending whether you hold it on Kama or Rabbi Yosi, and was poured into the golden shovel, which held 3 kav. But now you just had the golden shovel of 3 kav, and you didn't have anything else. Now, every year it was a heavy shovel. This year they used a special light one to make it easier for him. Every year it had a short handle. This year they had a long handle so that he could hold it actually in 2 places. He could use both hands. Every other year it was made out of yellow gold. This year it was made on Yom Kippur. It was every other day of the year it was made out of yellow gold. The one on Yom Kippur was made out of red gold. That is according to Rabbi Menachem. The Mishnah doesn't quote anybody who argues, but it quotes us in the name of Rabbi Menachem as a special simon, perhaps for the blood. It was red gold. Ketores, the rest of the days of the year, was brought half in the morning and half in the afternoon with the Karban Tamid, or just after the Karban Tamid. But on Yom Kippur there was a third bringing of Ketores, and that was this handful that was brought. Ketores every other day of the year was ground finely. Here it was ground super fine. It was put through the grinder again, so that it's very actually fine. Now, as far as ascending the Mizbeach, every day of the year, Kohanim went up on the eastern edge of the ramp, and they went around the Mizbeach, circling around in a counterclockwise fashion, and then they came down on the western edge of the ramp. The Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur went up in the middle and came down in the middle. That's because he was showing that we, Klal Yisrael, are comfortable in the house of Hashem. We don't mind walking across the ramp a little bit extra. Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda says that the Kohen Gadol himself always went up the middle of the ramp and came down the middle of the ramp. He did not have to go to the sides. The next thing is that the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur washed his hands from a flask of gold. That's different than every day of the year where they wash hands from the kiyar. And again, Rabbi Yehuda says the Kohen Gadol washed his hands from the gold flask every day of the year, not just on Yom Kippur. And how many fires were there in the Mizbeach? So there are 3 versions of this. The Gemara says that there was 1 extra on Yom Kippur than there was every day of the year. How many were there on Yom Kippur? 3 opinions. Tanakama says 5. Rabbi Meir says 5. Rabbi Yosi says that there were 4, and Rabbi Yehuda says that there were 3. Every day of the year there was 1 less. Now, the Gemara just has one kasha left on the daf here, and that is, how could he give the blood to a person who was standing on the 4th row of stones in the Heichal? We have a pasuk explicitly that says nobody's allowed to be standing in the Oel Moed, which is the equivalent of the Heichal when the Kohen Gadol goes into the Kodesh Kedashim. Gemara says that when we say the 4th row of stones of the Heichal, we don't mean the 4th row of stones in the Heichal, we mean for the 4th row of stones from the Heichal, that is outside.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.